Thank you. We're going to do a shift from behavior engineering and neurobiology to neurobiology of disease. And we have with us Professor Danny Michaelson. And I think one of the challenges that we all know is to try to understand how to treat brain disorders, starting from mental disorders through genetic disorders to neurodegenerative disorders. And I think one of the biggest challenges is really to try to understand Alzheimer's disease and try to prevent it or to treat it. And Professor Michaelson's lab is a pioneer lab in a specific field in Alzheimer's disease research and trying to understand the role of specific proteins and trying to find a cure for that. And Danny, we're happy you're here.
Thank you. I think there's a play of bats and men. I think it should be the title of our session. Well, the nightmare of a speaker is to come with the wrong slides. And that's actually what happened to me this morning. But luckily, my lab is 10 meters from here and I was able to correct that.
No, it's
name. So if the talk is off cue, it's because I was sweating going back and forth. What is on it? למה שניים? אוקיי, fine. יש פוינטר נפרד? טוב, אני אסתכל. בסדר. זה פוינטר? זה אני מביא? Okay, good morning everybody. Sorry it took so long to get set up. The challenge is to tell you all you wanted to know about Alzheimer's in 20 minutes, which is a bit of a challenge. So I will try and deal with principles, less with the details. And like all things Israeli, the talk will be divided into three parts. The first part, I will try and define what the issue at hand is. There's some misunderstandings about that in public. And then go after the definition directly to therapeutic approaches, which is really what we're all interested in. What is happening? What are the chances? When will the goodies be delivered? And the third thing would be, what can you do about it yourselves in the meantime, while we scientists are trying to solve number two? You can maybe do something about it number three personally, and that's going to be... The reason I have number three is the topic is a very depressive topic, and you have to end up with something optimistic. So this is why I have this thing at the end. Okay, so what is Alzheimer's disease? The first feature of Alzheimer's disease is what's called dementia. Dementia is a behavior feature, and it tells you something is wrong with the behavior of the patient. This is illustrated over here. The patient is being asked to draw himself, make a calculation, and and write a sentence, and the same patient 2 or 3 years later, and again 2 or 3 later, that's what he did. So the interesting thing is the patient knew that he was supposed to do something. The doctor told him, please do those things, and that's what he did. So it's literally a disintegration of the personality. So this is an illustration of dementia. Dementia is a behavioral thing. That's very important to know because there are many terms that the public mixes, and I will try and make order in that. So dementia is a behavior thing. It has to do with loss of language, loss of navigation, and at the end, loss of activity of daily living. Okay? So what is Alzheimer's disease? The unique thing about Alzheimer's disease is that Dr. Alzheimer, who's number 7 here, maybe Professor Alzheimer, I should say, he noted that in some people that have the dementia behavioral feature, this is associated with a specific damage in the brain. So this is good news, because beforehand, the notion was that dementia is an unavoidable feature of life. All of you know that life is a hill. You go up, you try to stick in the plateau, that's my stage, as much as you can, and then comes the downfill. Running after buses, I'm way past my plateau, but this is the way life is. We know that, okay? So until Alzheimer came, the notion was that dementia is unavoidable. This is c'est la vie, that's life. And when he found that there was something abnormal in half of the patients, I will define that in a minute, then the fact that he finds something abnormal is good news, because it means that we don't have to deal with the entire problem of aging, which is an important problem, but it's a huge problem, but rather to try and deal with a specific disease. So what did he find? He found, when he looked at the brain slices of patients, he found 2 types of things. One type, which is shown over here, these are called plaques. It's deposits of dead material, like plaques that we have on our teeth. It's outside of the tissue, and it's called plaques. In addition to that, he found some deposits within neurons, which are called tangles, and maybe we'll see later why they got the name tangles. But the important thing is that he looked at the brains and he saw some abnormalities. So it's these abnormalities together with the behavior which gives us the definition of Alzheimer's disease. Now clearly, and that's something I want to stress, this is a very tricky definition, okay? Because when you look at those things, depends on who you are. If you're an aggressive scientist who wants to get a Nobel Prize, you say, this is the cause of Alzheimer's disease, and if I do something about it, I will solve the Alzheimer's. If you're a skeptic, you say, this is not the cause of the disease. This is not even the dead body. This is the tombstone of an event that occurred before, okay? And this is something we don't know ahead of time. So there are a lot of risks that scientists have to take. Unlike the army, we don't die in taking those risks, but those are really important intellectual risks. What to do, what to focus on, and what to study. Because as I just said, this could be a very important thing, and this could be a side effect. So now that we know that the disease is very prevalent, and maybe an important point is that now that the developing world, it's really nice, this used to be called the underdeveloped world, but now politically correct, it's called the developing world. In developing countries, people live longer, and the number of patients that are expected to be there is increasing dramatically. So there's expected to be 34 million patients in 2025, and 36 billion per year is the cost. We just asked for one of it for research to try and save the other 35 that are being used. Okay, so that's the topic at hand. The disease is defined, the numbers are big, so clearly it's an important issue. The question now is, how do you start to study this disease? Okay, because the overall objective is to develop a pill that all of us over 50 will have in our pockets. We take it on Mondays, and this is it. Okay, that's really the driving force of the whole story. But you have to realize that to develop a pill is you have to have a chemical concept. What does this pill will entail in it? Because behavior is, with all due respect to people who do behavior, and I have a lot of respect to them, it doesn't give you immediately the handle of what chemical to use. Okay, and these scar tissues that I told you, who knows if they're important or not important? So what the field had to do was to make what's called decisions under situations of non-knowledge, okay? The question is, what do you do when you have what I just described to you? And what you do is two things. One, you humbly do comparison of the two types of brains, Alzheimer and control. Why do I use the word humbly? Because you don't know if what you'll find is important, but you make a list, okay? The brain has this, the brain has that. And you assume that what you find in the patients may be relevant to the disease. But you know very well that it may just be a coincidence. Like, as you know, Jews and Georgians have big noses and they play chess very well, but I haven't heard anybody yet claim that big noses make you play chess well. Okay? So just a causal coordination doesn't tell you anything. So that's one thing that's being done, to look for differences between patients and controls. And the other thing is genetics. If you look at the history of biology, the main, in my opinion, the most impressive advance that has happened in the last century is genetics. It's incredible that geneticists can come to a village in Sicily. Look at the registrar of the population of 3 generations. Okay, 3 generations. This one was ill, this one was not ill. And by doing that, at the end, can circum the problem and get to a molecule, which means to a capsule, which means to a chemical. It's quite impressive, I think, that to go from a registrar of 3 generational populations to a molecule, that's what they can do. Okay? So they can do that, and therefore everybody in every other field was a bit jealous, says, okay, maybe we can apply this thing to us. Now, it turns out that Alzheimer's disease is, to the most part, and I will stress that again later on, not genetic. I will use the word not familial, because genetic is a very vague term. Familial means that if your parents have it, you can predict that your kids will have it, okay? So 95% of the disease is not familial. That's very important to stress. But on the other hand, 5% is familial. So the scientists say, let's go to these 5%, study them, that's very kosher, very relevant, and assume that what we find there is going to be relevant to the sporadic disease, okay? That's very clean logic, but it has been very important to you to realize the risks involved, okay? The risk involved is what you find in the AD patient's brain may not be relevant, and the risk involved here is what you find in the familial is not the sporadic, okay? But you have to make advances, and that's how it's done, okay? So what this has led us to, and I will not be too detailed here because we only have the 20 minutes, this has led us to the discovery of a few molecules, okay? The names are over here. Each of these molecules has entered the story for its own reasoning. Okay, for example, the molecule number 1 was found to be in the plaques. Okay, so it makes sense if you find something in the plaques, or the molecule number 3, which is not Tel Aviv University, but tau, the molecule number 3, which is found in these structures, they have entered the game because of that. Okay, in addition to that, as I thought, so you have a list here of molecules which, through the Sherlock Holmes approach, entered the game. Okay, they are in the proper area of the patients. Also, there is genetics, okay? And genetics, I told you about the familial. So it turns out that there are some families that have mutations in a gene which is responsible for that, and so on. Okay, so there is now what we call the opening 5 molecules, okay, that have been entered the field, that each of them is valid, and we all fight within the field which is most important and which is the best target to try and do something about in the disease. But what is important for us to know is that we're making the transition from behavior to molecule, and that's a very important transition. I once gave a talk like this, and a lady with blue hair came to me at the end. She said, "I loved your talk very much, but what's a molecule?" So a molecule is just a name for its substance, okay? It's not, doesn't do anything too sophisticated. Okay, so we have here a few molecules that have been found. And I want to summarize also the genetics that have been found. The genetics is that, as I said, but it's very important to straight it over and over, 5% are genetics, and they are affiliated with specific molecules of those 5 that I showed. Most of the disease is sporadic. The sporadic cases are associated with risk factors. Okay, the word risk factor means that it's a risk to get the disease, but it doesn't cause it necessarily. Okay, that's different between a cause and a risk. So sporadic is associated with risk factors. For example, head injury. People who received a serious head injury, such as boxers, football players in America, and so on, they pay the price for that later on in life. Okay, so that's an important risk factor. I think that's why Jews concentrate on chess. You know, there's not too much head injury over there. So, okay, so there's head injury, and there are also some molecular risk factors, which I will maybe say something later on. But some of those genes, if you have a bad form, it makes you, it's a cause. Ken? Ken? Yeah. No, I'm not sure I understood it, but the question was maybe the relation between the fact that people live longer and genetics. So you're right that maybe if people live to the age of 500, we would find something which we haven't found yet. Okay? So we have the population that we have living to the age of 100 or 120, and within it we can identify genetic risk factors. But none of them are causal, meaning it's very important to realize the difference between risk factor and cause. Okay? You can have a risk factor which is not good for you, but you have some other things in you that protect that. On the other hand, if somebody chops your head, that's not a risk factor. That's a definite statement that you're out of the gate. Okay, so that sort of answers your question. Okay, so now we all in science like to talk about molecules, but there's also very important environmental factors. Okay, that's very important to stress because it also will come back to the end of the talk of what you can do about things to help yourself. Okay, so it turns out that education is very important. Okay? Now, unfortunately for us faculty members of the university, it's not the difference between full professor and associate professor. That is pretty much the same. But it's the first few years of life. If you're a shepherd or you have formal type of education, this makes a big difference. This is a study that's been found by Professor Korchin in Israel and Ashkelon, and with Professor Kahana, and also by Chinese in China, by Katzman in China. And the interesting thing is when they found the thing, just a gossip story, when they found the thing in Israel, what they did is they took Ashkelon, closed it conceptually, and went house to house to see what the prevalence of dementia is. Okay, dementia and Alzheimer's. And they got the numbers, and then they looked to see what does it correlate with. This was something which was done in the 60s. So these are people who in the 60s were in the 70s. So these were people who were young much earlier. Okay, you got the years. And they found that Sephardic Jews have more Alzheimer than Ashkenazi Jews. Okay? Now, this is a statement which has a lot of political weight. So luckily, before they made that statement, they also said, wow, let's look at education. And education, we know that at that generation, people who came from Europe had more formal education than people who came from North Africa. So they were clever enough not to jump to the first conclusion. And also, at the same time, there was a study in China where they don't have Sephardic Ashkenazi problems, that they found that education is protective, and therefore, we take that thing that education is protective. You may ask me, since I'm pushing the molecules direction, what does it mean by education being protective? I mean, do I think that a small Lilliput or midget comes into the brain and makes Alzheimer protections? That's not what we think. We think, the concept that we think is called cognitive reserve. Okay? If you have one highway between Netanya and Tel Aviv, and it's stuck with an accident, you can't move. Okay? But if you had 4 routes like that, if the one is stuck, you can bypass. So the concept really is that you are preparing reserves by being educated, and that these reserves are protective not against the biological damage, but against the ability to cope with the biological damage. Okay? Interestingly, there was a lovely study, I'm just improvising, but it's a very nice association. There's a non-order in the States that came to an agreement with University of Pittsburgh to give everything that they have to study Alzheimer's, okay? Everything means from whatever they wrote to their brains, okay? And a lot of interesting things came out, especially since nuns live a very regular life. So you can have what we call it's a controlled environment. They live quite steady life, and we can see. Now, the amazing thing is that those girls, when they were 14, wrote letters to the nun order requesting to be accepted, okay? And there were several types of letters. There was those letters that says, hi, bye, I want in. And there were letters which were very poetic and very elaborate. They found a correlation between the elaborateness of the letter at the age of 14 and not having Alzheimer's at a later age. I find that amazing, but it seems to be true, okay? So when you educate your kids to enlarge, maybe there's a reason to that. Okay, so now so now that's what I said. Okay, so now we have, we have genetics, we have molecules, we have genetics, environment, and we also have an interaction between them, okay? So you can ask yourself the question if bad or good environment is a function of the molecules, okay? So, okay, that's clear? So if you have, let's say you're a football player, an American football player, and you can ask those football players if they have those Alzheimer molecules and ask if one has or doesn't have, is it more susceptible to damage from an injury? And the answer is yes, especially regarding a specific molecule called ApoE4. So that just tells you that the environment and the genetics come together. So this is really where the field is. If you go to an Alzheimer conference, that's what you see. You see people talking about the, you can say the travel cost because you get the program here. You can see people talking about the different molecules. You can see people talking about the different environmental factors. Age is a clear issue which I did not talk about, that's obvious, and education and head injury and so on. And the question is, how do they go and give you the disease? Now, as you notice, I drew here lines that connect everything to everything, okay? So this is a politically very correct, but does not tell you anything, okay? So the real issue in the field is to study which of those arrows is more important than the others, and which arrow, if you block it, you can save the patients, okay? So this is really what the field is doing. The field is trying to understand how these molecules interact with each other, and which arrow, if we block it, we can block the disease, okay? That's a general concept of what the field is trying to do. So this gives us an introduction to the therapeutic approach part of the talk, where I want to describe to you in some detail what we try to do in the lab to try and help the disease. Okay. First of all, the intention is very straightforward. Here we have, this is years into the disease, and this is a scale of performance. High is good, low is bad. And you see here a regular type of curve for a patient. Starts good, and then within years it declines. And what we want to do are one of three things. The best thing, which probably will not be able to do, is to take this patient and bring it back to normal. Okay? The concept is that the brain is so complicated that to bring it back to normal is probably not going to be easy, or at least going to be the most difficult task ahead. So if you can't bring it back to normal, maybe you can stop it where it is and stop the progression of the disease. That makes more sense, especially if you can do the stopping early on. And the third thing, which is actually what we have in the market at the moment, is delay. If you look at this curve, it neither returns, it neither stops, but it delays. This curve is shifted relative to that curve, okay? So some of you may say, what's the big deal of delaying? If I have a father or mother that's Alzheimer's and I'll delay it by a year, I'm not so sure I'm getting any benefit. And that's something really that one can discuss. But in terms of the macroscopic scale, delaying institutionalization has a major effect in terms of the economy. Okay, so that's something not to say, well, it's only a delay thing. It's still very important. Okay, so now how do we go about trying to do something about the disease? Okay, what we know now that we have the molecules that I just talked to you about, which are the key molecules found in the disease. So you can say, if you're now heads of the NIH or NSF and you're dishing out money, you can say, well, I will give some money to people who focus on the key molecules, because maybe one of those key molecules is very important cause of the disease, okay? On the other hand, you can do a first aid approach. You say, okay, I do not know how to solve the major problem, but in the meantime, let's give them aspirin. You know that aspirin does not resolve the issue that causes the headache, but it resolves the headache, okay? So you could say, I could deal with the cause of the disease, and I can deal with the headache of the disease. And that's, do not belittle that. That's, those of us who have headaches and use aspirin know how important aspirin is, okay? So that's the second approach. And the third approach is, let's look and see from the literature if there's any other parameters which may be relevant, which is called epidemiology. Epidemiology is the field in which the doctors look at the patients and look what correlates with what, okay? And if they find that something in Jamaica, there's more patients than in Hawaii, they ask the question, what's different between Jamaica and Hawaii, and come with an hypothesis and so on. So this is also a very relevant approach to study the disease. So what I want to do is give you an illustration how this thing is being done without being too detailed. So one general approach, so I'm just illustrating approach now. One general approach is to use antibodies. Antibodies are things that the body has made to fight foreign elements, okay? The nice thing about antibodies, or the special thing about antibodies, is that they are very specific, okay? So if you make an antibody in the lab, for example, that recognizes the molecule ApoE4, that's the bad Alzheimer molecule, and does not recognize the good ApoE3 molecule, you have a conceptual tool in which you can treat the patients with this and try and help them, okay? I'm just giving you a tad of the general direction. We're not going into a lot of experimentation on that. So one approach is immunotherapy, which has been very valid in the field. And that's the only thing I wanted to say about the basic studies. Now, with the first aid, this is something quite interesting. When I talk to you, then this involves several things, but among other things, I talk and you listen, or at least hear me, okay? To hear me, you have to have good ears. To speak, I have to have reasonable voice, okay? Now, let's assume that the communication between us deteriorates because either I lose my voice or you lose your hearing, okay? Then what would you do? You'll give me a loudspeaker and you'll put an hearing aid. This will not work once we're completely deaf and dumb. That's, of course, not going to work. But that's why I call it first aid. This will work as we deteriorate coming down. We will give you something to make the speech louder and the hearing better. And this is really what is happening in the field, and that's what the drugs that are available now do. So I will illustrate that. This is a normal nerve terminal. Okay, neurons communicate and have terminals. And the oranges that you see in the terminals are chemical signal that goes from this is the mouth, if you want, and the mouth spits out those molecules that go to the ears, okay? And when there's enough molecules, then this one, what it says, this one hears, and everything's okay. But if you look at an Alzheimer nerve terminal, this is very weak, and weak means it has much less chemicals and sometimes also much less ears, okay? So the question is, what can you do to make an Alzheimer nerve terminal speak more loudly, more effectively than and bring it back to normal? So there are two types of things. One is a loudspeaker approach, which has been very successful in Parkinson, okay, not in Alzheimer yet, but in Parkinson, and that is to give a precursor. You see those blue squares over here. They are not the chemical molecule that the brain uses, but they are precursor. Chemically, the body can make the squares become circles, okay? So therefore, if you have a very weak nerve terminal like the one over here, you can give this precursor or the loudspeaker approach, and you can improve things and get better, okay? So that's one thing. The second thing could be the hearing aid, okay? Now, the hearing aid is more complicated to explain, but again, we have here the weak synapse. What we do, those microphones or chocolate or ice cream cones, what they are chemicals, drugs that we give to the patient, which are very similar to the original yellow ones, okay? The blue ones by themselves don't do anything because we put a low level. The yellow ones by themselves don't do anything because the body has few of them. But when we put them together, we can get a signal, okay? So this is, again, another approach of the hearing aid. But the drugs which are on the market now, they do enhance the communication, but not by neither of these concepts, by a third one. And that third one has to do with Bedouins in the desert. What do I mean by Bedouins in the desert? What problems does a Bedouin have that we don't have? Many, maybe. But one of them relates to the echo, okay? So when a Bedouin is in the desert, in a wadi, and he speaks, he has to take the echo into consideration because he doesn't know if the wadi answers or if he answers. We don't have to worry about it because we have, in our urban society, we have a lot of things that absorb and there's no really serious echo. So the beautiful thing about, and that's something I've learned through my life, every good idea that I have, I find out that God already thought about it, and I'm not religious, okay? So this whole idea of echo is something that biology also thought about, okay? Because if you look You look at this guy. This is just an illustration. It's a healthy nerve terminal. This one speaks. This one listens, okay? So nature has devised Pacmans which cut away these molecules so that there will not be an echo. Because this one who hears does not know where the words came from. Is that clear? Okay. So there's an echo. So now look what happens at a poor Alzheimer's synapse. A poor Alzheimer's synapse, not only that it has very few oranges or very few chemical transmissions, but it also has the echo, because anti-echo device. So it releases very few oranges, and the echo cuts them away. So if we do a minus equals plus, if we block these echo molecules, then they will not be active. Here are the blue things. And as a result, the oranges will live longer. That's okay? I get some nodding from the guys under the age of 40. I hope those over 60, it's also okay. Okay. So this actually is the way the field treats Alzheimer's disease at the moment. The drugs, Exelon and so on, that are on the field, what they do is block those Pacmans, and as a result of it, prolong the ability of the cells to communicate. Clearly, this is no panacea. Clearly, this does not solve the problem altogether, but as we said earlier, if you can communicate, improve communication while you can communicate, it's still something very important, and that's what it does. Okay, so the third thing is epidemiology, and that is, do people find any other correlations that find? For example, somebody had the idea that maybe cholesterol is important, okay? It's not a ridiculous idea, okay, because cholesterol is bad for your blood vessels, blah, 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 maybe. So all he did was he went and said, okay, who studies cholesterol in the world, okay? And there are people who study statins. You know what statins are? These are drugs that reduce cholesterol, okay? So all they did was one telephone call to the biggest statin study, asking, would you please check if there are less or more Alzheimer's in the people who take statins, okay? Fantastic, there are less Alzheimer's, okay? So they found that lowering cholesterol is good for you, although those of you who are very critical will say that this is not a very controlled study because it was not done on the average population, but on a very test subpopulation. But just to give you an illustration that what is being done is having to do with cholesterol is a major issue, and another issue which is being studied very nicely, I'm calling it from the side, so not going systematically to the Alzheimer's research, is inflammation. Inflammation, you know, the task of inflammation is to fight bad things that come into the body, okay? Bad things can be from the outside, or bad things could be also from the inside. If something deteriorates and breaks, inflammation comes in. So people looked at the Alzheimer's brain and found inflammation. Inflammation could be good or bad, okay? It could be either removing debris or attacking the tissue. Doesn't matter. Found inflammation. The important point to illustrate to you is how do people think in the field. So then a very clever couple in Canada, the McGears, said the following. What do we know about inflammation in the general life, in the population? We know rheumatic arthritis. You know of rheumatic arthritis? Delicate bronchitis. In rheumatic arthritis, people get anti-inflammatory drugs for treatment. So they went and studied whether the people who have rheumatic arthritis have less Alzheimer, okay? And found the answer to be yes. And as a result, opened another field that said, we will maybe try and treat the disease not along the lines that I described before, but along the lines that either lower cholesterol or affect brain inflammation. So this is what we do for you. Now what can you do for yourself, okay? The principle in life is not what Shalom Aleichem said. I don't know if you recall Shalom Aleichem and Potten Pacey. When he got a coat, it was hanging around in the cupboard, and once a year during the critical day, Passover I think it was, he got it out and he worked. Yeah, biology doesn't work like that. Biology works on the principle of use it or lose it. It's valid all over life, and I want to say something about connecting it to Alzheimer's. So when we talk about the physiology of life, I think we all agree, there's no argument about use it or lose it, okay? If you use it, you get it, and if you don't, you get something else, okay? So use it or lose it in the physical world is very clear. That's very obvious, okay? How about use it or lose it when we go up to the cognitive world, okay, to the brain, okay? We like to say muscles of the brain. If I say muscles of the brain, I immediately say that it's going to work. But who gives me the right to call the brain muscles? There's no muscles there in the real sense of the word. So when we go into the brain, we see some nice experiments that show us that experience works. This is a classical imprinting where Lawrence found that the thing that moves first near a chick hatching is the parent. So he was the parent of many chicks, and There many times he gave talks, and he would get the chicks in the morning, not the chicks, but these chicks, in the mornings, and let them hatch, and then he would walk on the stage, and they were following him very obediently. So that's an example of environment experience modulating behavior. But it's not a very good example because it's very strict. It's not plastic. What happens, happens, and that's it. The question is whether anything that we do during our life, like the physical muscles, can improve our brain. Okay? So again, and that's a point I'm trying to illustrate throughout, that it's nice to have original, clever people in the field who have good ideas that are not classical. So somebody had this clever idea, said, London is a very complicated city. Okay? The geometry of London, unlike New York, is not rectangular, it's a mess. Because it's a mess, to be a taxi driver in London, you have to be a sir in transportation. Okay? It's a major thing, you have to pass exams and so on. Okay? So he asked us, so the researcher asked himself the question, what happens in the brain of the taxi drivers in London, in the area which is in charge of navigation? Okay, we know the brain area in charge of navigation. So what happens to that? And what he found, which I think was incredible, this is the area, doesn't matter. He found that this is here the size of the area increasing in that direction, and this is months as a taxi driver. Okay? And what you can see, it's not a straight line, but you definitely get the direction that the more you drive, the more you get brain area. Now, the difficult thing about science is to have controls. So somebody else was very clever, and what did he use as control? The bus drivers. Because the bus drivers would drive the same route all the time, okay, and did not get that curve, okay? So there's a very elegant game that's being played, and I think what it tells us is that there's something that we can do with our brains, and this, of course, tells us why the New York taxi drivers are rude and not intelligent, because their task is very different. Okay, so the conclusion here is, and that's a general conclusion, if you look, I'm diverging a minute to make it interesting for me. If you look at last century, I think a major event that took place is physical exercise, okay? I mean, the Greeks discovered it way before, but we've come back to that, and I think that's now accepted, that that's good for health. I think what will happen in the coming years, that people will do the same thing with the brain. We live longer, we retire longer, and the issue of passive retirement, which was the dream of every Polish peasant in last century, I think is going to be out, and it's going to be replace your job, which maybe you hate, with something else which is very important. And to make a point about how this is important, there's a lady called Claudia Keiwas. She's, by the way, the granddaughter of the mayor of Bethlehem from the 30s, but she's a neurologist by herself, independent of that. And she's studying the 100-year-old Sayeret Matkal, the 100-year-old super healthy guys, okay? And she's asked the question, what makes those guys so much better? By looking at what they do compared to others. And the main thing that she finds is that they do a lot of social activity, okay? They volunteer to the Scouts, they volunteer to Maccabi Tel Aviv, they volunteer to this, to that, and it doesn't saturate, okay? Many times, in effect, saturates. Like with sports, it's enough to do half an hour. Here, the more you do, the better, and I think that's something very important to keep in mind. Anecdotally, she asked the question whether being married is an advantage. And what did she find at the age of 100? She found that for men it's an advantage, for women it's not. Which I think we all sense that thing intuitively is to be correct. Okay, so just before ending, I want to say that there's an emerging feeling in the field, because it's so difficult to treat, to deal with prevention, okay? But we're not there yet in the full sense of the word that we can tell you guys that if you do this and this and that, you can prevent it completely. All we're saying is that you can shift the curve in the right direction, okay? So the use it or lose it is one thing, and I think there's a lot of other things which are very relevant that are sort of emerging in the field to deal with your blood vasculature. The whole issue of blood and brain is very tricky. There used to be a time, my age, my generation, used to call dementia sclerosa. You familiar with that term? What was that meant? That was meant that the blood vessels are sclerotic, are not functioning, and therefore you have the disease. So 40 years it was called sclerosa. Now it's called Alzheimer, neurodegeneration. What does neurodegeneration mean? The nerves degenerate. But if you look at the brain, you see that the blood vessels and the neurons are so intricately connected that you have to be naive to think that the disease can be only one and not the other. Okay, so therefore the good things that you do related to vasculature are good for you. Cognitive engagement is what I talked about. Physical activity is what the Greeks have discovered, and that's also related to the vasculature. And of course, there's also the question of Mediterranean diet that's supposed to be good for you. There's also the issue of wine, although there the skepticals say that this wine, red wine, being good for you is research supported by the wine industry in France. So I don't know for sure to say, but the Mediterranean diet is considered to be something very healthy, and I think this is what I wanted to say to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much.
Yeah.
What about sleeping habits and alcohol consumption?
Okay. The alcohol is supposed to, I don't know, first of all, in a sense, that they do have sleeping problems, that I know, and there are people who are trying to help the Alzheimer patients by giving melatonin, which is a drug which repairs your sleeping habit. So there is a sleeping problem in Alzheimer's for sure. The alcohol, the answer is in wine. A moderate amount of wine is supposed to be good, but I don't know whether it's the alcohol, I don't know, or the additives, which are antioxidants in the wine. That's open for. But I would say everything in moderation is good for you. Just
I mentioned that did you find any relation to the sleeping habits of a person? Like average sleeping hours, 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day? Has it any relation to disease?
Predicting in the future?
Yeah.
I don't know about the predicting. I only know about once you're in the disease, they sleep less well. But the prediction in the future, I don't know. But because kids sleep 12, 14 hours at the beginning, and I don't know, I can't answer you. Yes?
I don't know the answer, but there's recent research showing that in the period of where rats sleep deeper, there's an expansion of the extracellular spaces in the brain, and that this is associated with clearance of amyloid, and that's a very hot area of research. So stay tuned, and I think they have done some epidemiological study they're doing that, but I don't know the results.
Okay, please.
There is a treatment in epilepsy.
Epilepsy, yes.
Nutritional treatment. It's called ketogenic diet. When the brain is switching from generating power from glucose to ketone bodies. I know that it is helping in some cases.
The answer was that you can switch from a regular glucose-based diet to ketone diet, and that is a well-known metabolic option, and that it helps in epilepsy. I've heard about that being talked in Alzheimer's, but I have not heard it being reported, okay? So I don't really know. Yeah.
You spoke about the Mediterranean diet and about cholesterol. Do you think there is any positive correlation between consumption of vitamins in your diet and increasing your diet to Alzheimer's disease?
I know, I don't really know, okay? But I do know that many Alzheimer's scientists take statins, even though they don't really need them in the high cholesterol level, and take vitamin supplements. I personally don't take because I'm very conservative and I don't believe in playing God sort of thing. Because everything has so many side effects, but that's personal, okay? So, but that's my answer. Sorry, please.
It's a rumor sort of that the coconut butter can help.
I have a problem there myself because it changes all the time. Olive oil is the standard thing considered to help, and olive oil is polyunsaturated and so on and so forth. And now the coconut came, and to me, I have to be very humble because I don't know the details, but it doesn't make sense. It does not make sense. It's like the opposite of what olive oil is, and I don't understand.
Coconut is the opposite of the oil.
The basic structure of coconut and oil as a molecule is different. So if you believe in that, I don't see how you can believe in that. But this is not. But I use the word believe, which is a weak word. Okay, belief is for religion, not for science. So I don't know the data enough to say because it could be.
They're for the statins, but they say that the statins cause problems in memory.
I don't know about that. I know they cause some. Anybody here? I don't know. I know that important neurologists take statins. That's the only thing I know, and that means to me that because you have to balance. Okay, I mean the whole like taking drugs is balancing pros and cons, and please.
With all those factors, do you have like tools today to check on 40 years old and predict at some level?
Yeah, the most important advance, and actually gave it very little attention here, which was maybe a mistake, is imaging. Okay? Because up to before imaging came, everything was really a one-time point that the patient had to die. I mean, you had to take the brain, ta-ta-ta. So imaging has been extremely powerful in the sense, I'd say some details, but in principle, in enabling you to go back to the same patient over and over again and see what is happening. And one of the take-home messages from the imaging is that, first of all, the best thing is to use yourself as your standard, okay? So it's not an absolute statement, what's the size of this area or that area, but it's how much that area declines over time in your brain particularly, which is an indication that you are facing problems. So, but I think this is definitely a field of the future to enlarge on that more. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Really, thank you very much for the speakers and for the audience and for Mira and for the committee of helping in organizing it. And I just want to for the audience just a promise for the audience who are very interested in that, and we are really happy to hear it, that at the beginning of next academic year we are going to have another open public session. It's going to be in a TED-like show, so short 15 minutes with some more interactive that will be somewhere in October or November, and we will send you information about it. So thank you very much. Shabbat Shalom, and see you next year.